Afternoon, everybody, and thanks for bearing with us as we worked out a few technical challenges, but we are live and welcome to the SGIA Apparel Decorators session today on COVID-19. The SGIA, for those of you who don't know, is an association built by and for the printing industry. And to learn more about the benefits of becoming a member, we invite you to head over to sgia.com after this session and get signed up to receive updates. But today we're excited to bring four incredible panelists to you live to help understand and unpack a little bit of how COVID is impacting us as business leaders in the print community. I was very inspired by a quote from Danny Sween the other day, who's the CEO of M&R Companies. He said earlier this week, "The industry will not die. It will not go away. Batten down the hatches, survive the next several months, and we'll be more creative than ever." My friends, we've got four incredible panelists today that are going to help us do just that, figure out how to navigate through all these uncertainties, and really help us analyze the emerging patterns in our industry so that we can follow them. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Adriane, our first of four panelists, to give a brief introduction, and then we'll move forward with everybody else. Adriane, how are you?
Thank you. I'm well. Thank you very much. My name is Adriane Harrison. I'm the Vice President of Human Relations at Printing Industries of America, and I am here to sort of help you navigate those difficult HR issues that this crisis has involved, anywhere from staffing to PPP to other aspects of protecting your workforce in the workplace and getting you going if you're not going and keeping you going if you are.
Hey, Pete. This is Marci Kinter. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for SGIA, and I'm here to answer the questions that everyone might have on safety in the workplace, on the whole concept of states reopening, because we are starting to see states are issuing their roadmaps to recovery and starting to reopen those non-essential businesses, as well as just talk a bit about what it is that businesses should be doing when they do start to reopen.
Right. Lisbeth.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lisbeth Lyons. I'm Vice President of Government and External Affairs for Printing Industries of America. And it's my job to be up on Capitol Hill representing the printing industry and advocating for policy that both benefits and protects the printing and graphic communications industry. As you can imagine, that agenda right now is all COVID all the time. And I'm here today to answer any questions you might have about the federal legislative response, the mitigation that's currently going on, and look ahead to see what else might be coming down the road in terms of legislative reforms coming out of this pandemic.
Right. Andy.
Hi, Pete. Thank you. My name is Andy Paparozzi. I'm an economist with SGIA, and I'm here to talk a little bit about when we can actually expect recovery to start and what that recovery is likely to look like. V-shaped, U-shaped. And I'd also like to share some important research we just kicked off not 2 weeks ago, devoted to understanding two things. Number one, how deeply the COVID economic crisis is affecting our industry, and more important, what we call a path forward. How we can help printers not only get through the crisis, but prepare to participate fully in the recovery that will follow.
Fantastic. Well, I think we got a really well-rounded, objective insights into everything that we're going to talk about today. And why don't we go ahead and just dive right in. So, Adriane, I'm going to pose the first question to you. You mentioned in the intro the PPP loan program, the Payment Protection Program, which or the Paycheck Protection Program, which has gotten a lot of buzz, and also I think created a lot of confusion for a lot of the small business owners right there. So could you walk us through just some basic overview of the PPP program, and then specifically talk to us about how we might utilize these funds, and also how we might go about getting back to the headcount we need so that this loan can be forgiven when that time comes.
Sure, absolutely. So the PPP program is essentially a forgivable loan if the money is used in the manner that is intended. If money is used in a way that isn't forgivable, it's a 2-year note at a 1% interest rate that will be forgiven, that will start 6 months. There's a deferred first payment. It'll be 6 months after the close of the loan term. So if you are a lucky recipient of a PPP loan, that can be used for your payroll expenses. It is not used for FICA, but it can be used for your other payroll expenses, including your health plan costs and things of that nature. You need to keep your payroll at 75%. And this is one of those confusing elements, I think, Pete, that people have. Is it 75% of salary or wages per person, or is it an overall average of 75%? So that's an answer where there is that's a question for which there has been no official answer. So the answer is, to the best of our ability, is that your average and your individuals should be kept at 75% or above. And the loan theoretically is not forgivable if the average drops below 75%. However, if you are able to get it back to that 75% level before the end of your loan term, then you will be excused for that dip, and that your loan will still be forgivable if you hit that mark at some point then before the loan term ends. So the loan term begins when the money is dispersed from the financial institution and hits your account. It's not the day that you got approved, and it's not the day you sign the papers. It's the day the money actually gets delivered to you. And then it's an 8-week term after that. You can pay people, for instance, somebody could be paid at 100%, somebody could be paid at 80%. You don't want people being paid at 60% if you can help it. There's quite a few, I think, ins and outs of the loan, but it is really meant to pay for payroll, utilities, mortgage interest, not principal, and rent. So that is the purpose of the loan.
Awesome. And Adriane, since we're on this topic, we've got a question from Dom Rosacci out in Colorado. Okay. He's asking if there are any fraudulent issues or complications if you applied for this with more than one bank. So I know a lot of people were kind of scrambling to get applications in and not hearing back. So any guidance on how to deal with that?
So, I can't, again, this is one of those situations where there's nothing official. And of course, there's been no enforcement or anything like that. So this is frankly an unofficial answer to the question, which is, I think more than a few companies applied with multiple institutions because they weren't sure they were going to get in. And bigger banks were having greater success penetrating that barrier. And so you may have started with a small bank and gone to a big bank or vice versa. If you get approved twice, that's a glitch in the system that shouldn't have happened, because your EIN information and all that is what's being stored in the government database. So I don't think it's fraud to have applied twice. I've not heard of this. However, if somebody were to receive 2 PPP loans for the same company based on the same information, then I think one of them would need to be returned or, don't accept it. So that would protect you. I don't think anybody's going to come after you for trying with a different institution if it didn't work the first time.
Got it. Well, I know Dom well, and he's a pretty crafty guy. He can get off the grid quickly. So yeah. I'm not worried about him figuring his way out through that. Yeah. Awesome. Marci, we're going to turn it over to you for the next question. And this is actually great because we were sort of talking about this before we went live, but obviously a big wave of potentially new and more important OSHA regulations as we kind of come out of this COVID haze and back into operation. What OSHA regulations address workplace safety, and potential exposure to the COVID-19 virus, and what are things that we should be actively putting in place now to make our team members safe and also promote just better health practices in the working environment?
Yeah, it's really interesting because OSHA already has on its books quite a few regulations that do apply to this situation. So when you start to look at the OSHA regulatory framework, the first thing everyone needs to understand is that the general duty clause will always apply. Meaning if they can't find a specific OSHA regulation, they can come in under the general duty clause. And I do want to make everyone who's listening aware that the state and federal OSHA agencies are inspecting, that they are seeing a larger than expected number of employee complaints. And that really shouldn't be that surprising that employees are complaining that the workplaces aren't providing the correct personal protective equipment, or they're not following CDC guidelines. So we encourage the employers to make sure they have a sanitation program in place. There are sanitation regulations already there for OSHA. We do have a sanitation guide up on the COVID-19 resource page, so I encourage people to go to that page and to take a look at the sanitation guide, to download it and to start to implement. There is requirements up there, requirements for personal protective equipment, and we were talking earlier before we went live about face masks. Mm-hmm. And face masks are considered respirators. So they are covered under the respiratory standard. Obviously, you don't have to do fit tests and make sure that, but you do need to make sure they're medically competent and able to breathe through the face mask. And then always there's the record keeping and reporting. We've been getting quite a few questions about, well, how do I report or record a COVID-19 incident in my workplace? And OSHA has somewhat relaxed the guidance and relax the reporting and record keeping rule. So only if you know and you have evidence that an employee has COVID-19 as a result of workplace exposure do you need to really record that as an OSHA recordable injury or illness. But all the OSHA regulations are in full effect. If you bring in new sanitation chemicals, you need to cover your employees under your HAZCOM right to know training program. So there's the fundamental regulatory structure is there. It's just putting it to a finer point specifically for COVID.
Awesome. Well, this is, I think, going to be a hot topic for the next couple of weeks and months as we try and navigate this new future of operating businesses. But let me also mention that SGIA has put up a really helpful page, the COVID-19 resource page. So any of y'all haven't visited that, I encourage you to go there. It's a great place to consume and access the most relevant information for COVID-19. And a lot of the panelists on the call today are actively contributing as they get clarity on things. We're putting it up on the site to help all the printers and apparel decorators around the country. Mm-hmm. All right, Lisbeth, we're going to kick it to you for the next question. And this is kind of on the heels of what we talked with Adriane a little bit about. But there are two loan programs out there. There's the PPP and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or the EIDL. Would just love for you to provide a little clarity on the difference between the two. What is right for which business owner? Can they apply for both? And just any other things we should be aware of related to these programs.
Sure, happy to. As Adriane said, the big draw to the PPP loan program is that it is a forgivable loan. That is the biggest difference between the PPP loan and the EIDL. As Peter said, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. So that's a key difference. However, the EIDL loan is not something that should be overlooked. And there's been some confusion as to whether or not a small business with 500 employers or less could apply for both loans. And the answer is yes, you can have both loans. The real caveat here, and where you probably really need to spend some time and resources talking to your company's accountant, is that you cannot use the funds for the same purpose. So if you're using the PPP for your rent, you cannot use the EIDL funds for your rent. They have to be used for separate purposes. The EIDL fund also has a unique feature where upon application, there's a $10,000 advance that's provided by EIDL. And that advance itself is forgivable. So there's a very small portion of the EIDL that is forgivable. Another big difference, just the way that this has played out on the COVID stage, is that PPP was a program Congress created specifically in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Likewise, you can imagine it has gotten the most publicity. So a lot of people are applying for PPP. There's been a huge rush on funds. It's been recapitalized once already. Started at $349 billion. It was recapitalized last week, and the program reopened this past, or actually yesterday, or Monday, excuse me, Monday morning with another $310 billion in funds. The EIDL program has not been as heavily capitalized. It was not initially as heavily subscribed to. I think as small business owners and people in our industry started realizing they had a fear of being shut out of PPP, there started to be more of a run on applications for the EIDL program. As of right now, if you go to the Small Business Administration website, and that is kind of the jumping off point for comparing these various lending programs, sba.gov, G-O-V, you will see that it says, due to a lapse in appropriations, we are no longer accepting, or I should say not at this time accepting, loan applications for EIDL. We're processing the ones that were sent in before the funds lapsed, and there's a hold on the application process. In the most recent round of stimulus legislation, there was another $60 billion approved for EIDL. It has not come online yet, and we haven't been able to get a really clear answer on timing from SBA as to when that loan application process will open up for business. Someone else, I think Marci mentioned the COVID-19, or actually I think Peter, you mentioned the COVID-19 resource page. We certainly we're blogging on any updates, and as soon as that is reopened, we will let people know via the COVID-19 resource page. I will say there's another loan program that also people may be overlooking. It's geared toward the mid-market businesses, and that is the Main Street Loan Program. That is something that businesses up to 10,000 employees can qualify for. So there are a few different loan programs out there. There are also the pre-COVID SBA loans, 7A, 7B loans. So it's really wise to take a look at sba.gov and check out all the lending options and talk with your accountant about what you think is best for your particular company and what combination might be best.
That's awesome. And again, I think this is going to require some ongoing research and evaluation because things are moving so quickly. Alex just asked, and Lisbeth, you kind of touched on this, but do we have any definitive date on when they will open the loan applications for the EIDL, or are we still waiting on that?
Still waiting on that, literally as we speak, still waiting on that time.
It's been funded, but we just don't know when they'll start processing.
You know, similar to the PPP, that extra $310 billion was approved last week by Congress, but the new applications for PPP didn't open until 10:30 a.m. this past Monday. So there is a lag time.
Awesome. Real quick, before we jump to a whole nother topic, just to kind of close this out, between Lisbeth, Adriane, and obviously Andy, Marci, if you got anything, but what would you suggest to the business owner or business manager who has not started this process yet? Where should they, who and where should they go to get a start on this and decide what loan they're going to apply for and who they're going to partner with?
Well, I think the PPP loans, if they're still being funded, because it's a forgivable loan, it is, if you play your cards right, free money is a great place to start. You don't even have to be working. I mean, you could be hibernating and get a PPP loan and pay your employees for 2 months. So, that's my 2 cents. I don't know, Lisbeth, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. Again, the benefit of the PPP and the distinguishing factor is its forgiveness, provided that you follow the applicable rules. So, and that's probably worth commenting on too. I would say document, document, document.
Right.
In terms of what you're spending your PPP funds on, because every bank will have a slightly different process to put forth through the forgiveness program. But I agree, start with the PPP. Look into the economic injury disaster loan, even perhaps the Main Street loan. And again, SBA.gov, I usually refrain from sending people to government websites because they can be as bureaucratic and full of red tape as government agencies themselves. But I will say that the SBA has done a great job with its COVID page. So again, that's sba.gov. And I think, take a look at that. And then talking with your own accountant, I think, is really important too.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that on the documenting part of that Lisbeth mentioned. I think it's critically important. And if you use a payroll provider, they have been very quick to now be able to track how your PPP money is spent on payroll once the money is funded to you. So use all your resources possible. And, when all else fails, use an Excel spreadsheet.
Awesome. Thank you all. All right, Andy, let's get you some airtime. We've been talking a lot about policy and really more how businesses can play defense with regards to stimulus programs and support programs. But good news today, stock market's rallying. There's over $2 trillion in aid that's already been deployed. You were talking about it earlier. What's the economy going to do? Is it going to be a V? Is it going to be a U? Is it going to be an L? Can you just kind of walk us through what you're seeing in relation to the economic recovery that feels like it's starting to gather some momentum as people kind of come out of their caves and look to reenter society? And what can we expect as a community, as an industry, related to kind of what's going on nationally and internationally with the economy?
Yes, certainly, Pete. And the consensus among very, very prominent Wall Street and Washington economists is that recovery is going to begin next quarter and accelerate in the fourth quarter and then strengthen progressively in 2021. The V shape, sharp down and then sharp up. And I don't mean to be negative, I just want to be realistic, but I can't see it. I think, and I'll explain why, we're looking at a recovery that is more of a U shape, where we bounce along bottom for a while. And I'll tell you why I say that, because this recession is unprecedented in cause and effect. Its causes were biological, not economic. And as much as the Federal Reserve is doing to stimulate the economy, as much as Washington is doing to stimulate the economy, the reality is, even when social distancing is eased, even when shelter in place is eased, even when states begin to reopen, how comfortable are we really going to be about going to malls and going to the theater and going on airplanes, to conventions and to hotels and restaurants and all the kinds of things we were perfectly comfortable doing on March 10th? Mm-hmm. And how many of the small businesses economy-wide that have had to shutter are going to survive this? And how easily can the businesses that survive get their workforce back together and begin functioning efficiently again. And just another thing I was reading about earlier today, liability. You know, the reality is we like to sue each other. And as business reopens, as economic activity sort of trends back to normal, you know, unless Washington passes some kind of indemnity program or governors through executive order pass some kind of indemnity program, we may be looking at a whole lot of lawsuits. You know, I came into your establishment as an employee, as a consumer, and I got COVID-19. And guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to sue you. Now, that kind of thing is hardly going to facilitate recovery. So my point is that because this crisis, this economic recession is so unique and so different from what we've experienced in the past, you know, usually it's pretty easy. The Fed pumps up the money supply, Washington tries to stimulate, and eventually off we go. But because this thing has been so unique in terms of not only effect and depth and scope, but cause, biological, not economic, I think we need to consider the likelihood of a slower recovery, where contraction slows next quarter, the upturn begins gradually in Q4 2020, and then accelerates sometime in 2021. So my opinion is we should be preparing for that kind of recovery by doing all the kinds of things my fellow panelists are advising and that they've written about in on the COVID-19 resource page. And again, that's
All right, we'll come back to Andy and get more on that. It's interesting. I'm tracking with what he's saying, and I've heard a lot of people start to refer to the V, the U, the L, and actually more economists are actually predicting it's more of like a Nike swoosh, where we don't V right back up, but it's this gradual increase in Q4 and even Q1 of next year that really will start to see things return. So not the most optimistic, but also not doomsday, where we're just going to be stuck in this downward cycle for forever. So I'm going to jump to another kind of HR regulation question. As people start to come back to work, what are some practical things that we can do and should do as it relates specifically to face masks, social distancing, and temperature checks? Those are three things that are kind of in the chat and people asking about specifically. So maybe this is something everybody can kind of weigh in, but face masks, temperature checks, social distancing, how do we need to manage those three things?
Right. Well, here's the HR perspective on that. The EEOC has, sort of changed their rules as this COVID thing has evolved, and it is okay to take temperature checks of your employees as they come in. There's no hard and fast rule about when somebody should go home. I'm recommending 100 degrees means you head home and you can try again tomorrow. But if you have 100-degree temperature, then it's probably better to not come to work that day. On that note, when we do send people home because they appear not to be healthy, we need to record that carefully, because that can be reimbursable through tax credits under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So it won't actually cost you money. It'll cost you a person working in the facility, but it won't cost you money to send them home. And Marci and I were talking about this offline, and Marci can weigh in, but with masks, if you're going to make them required, then you need to provide them. My recommendation is you can set up a system where everybody gets at least 3 masks. It should not be fewer than that, so that you are wearing one is in the hopper ready to go, and one might be dirty and waiting to be laundered. So you have to, if you're going to make it mandatory, provide at least 3 masks per person. Ideally, you're doing 5 to 7. You can make it voluntary. That's possible too. As far as the footprint of 6 feet apart in the printing industry, that actually isn't that hard to do in most instances. You know, depending on your facility and how it's set up, you can do no contact exchanges, and you can typically stay 6 to 10 feet apart if you think about what you're doing. As far as people who work close together, I suggest plexiglass dividers between workstations and masks while you're at your workstation if your workstation is close to somebody else. Otherwise, a lot of companies are allowing masks to be taken off at your workstation if your workstation is a good distance away from other people. So that's sort of the rule of thumb that is kind of forming as we all learn how to go about doing this.
And I'd like to add that we're starting to see, as states are issuing their opening up strategies, how to reopen the businesses. And they have some states, and I encourage you to, check with us and email us, because states started out by obviously shutting down all but essential businesses. And then the governor started issuing workplace guidelines for those essential businesses, which included many of the items that Adriane was talking about, requiring social distancing, requiring face masks, especially if you were doing anything in a retail setting and you had to be exposed to the public. Looking at contactless work environments, which is the plexiglass. And as they're reopening the businesses, and this gets to what Andy was talking about, where do you really want to go to the mall after you haven't been there for 2.5 months, is they are requiring all businesses to implement the wearing of face masks. You have a lot of states that still require, if you go outside your door, you wear a face mask. So we encourage businesses to really take a look at what their specific state is doing. You find this information on the COVID site, but you also find it if you look on the State Department of Health sites, because that's where a lot of the information, other than financial, this is where a lot of the information is residing as to shelter in place orders, what businesses need to do, what businesses can open, etc. So we encourage everyone to do that and to actually start to develop policies to put in place, if they haven't already, regarding sanitation. How often are you going to clean? Who's going to clean, etc. So if you think of what the grocery stores are doing now, where they have the set hours and then they close and everyone goes in a flurry of cleaning throughout the entire store, that's a similar model that I think companies who are opening or who have been opened should take a look at.
Pete, I want to add one more thing, which is if you run multiple shifts, staggering your shifts so there's no crossover and you're limiting the number of people in the building. I know companies that have staggered it as little as 10 minutes apart, others that have staggered it by 30 minutes. And usually if you leave a gap of at least 15 and you have a disinfecting crew come through, that's helpful as well.
Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would piggyback onto what Andy Paparozzi said a minute ago regarding the coming concern about a litigation pandemic following the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this case, all the things that Adriane and Marci have just talked about, I think many companies, all of us really in society, the pandemic playbook is being written as we're playing the game. And so I think it's really important to document as much as you can. Because there's no doubt that there is going to be litigation that comes out of this. And there's already talk on Capitol Hill. I think you're going to see a really big partisan fight coming down the pike on legal reform and some type of business liability shield. It's typically a very partisan issue. It's my hope that the fact that everyone, both political parties, have pulled together on so much of the response to COVID-19, that we might be able to find some common ground, but it's going to be, it won't be policy that happens overnight. So everybody needs to document, and I hate to be pessimistic, but prepare as though you need to defend yourself.
Yeah, and you read the question perfectly. we've had a couple comments in the chat populate of just that. I mean, I think there's a real fear of, am I going to be sued? And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying anything's possible. So the best offense is a strong defense. And I think all the panelists gave some really good practical next steps on how to protect ourselves as business owners or business operators and the rest of the team that's working here. Adriane, our facility has gone to that of staggering shifts and not cross-pollinating our team. So each team, you work with those 4 or 5 people for the future, and we're spacing things 30 minutes out, and they're cleaning everything before the next shift comes in, just to eliminate cross-contamination.
There's other tips that people have, having somebody and if you don't have a team that's just dedicated to sanitizing, give an assignment every hour. Somebody has to wipe down door handles and things like that. I've heard of companies that have started just bringing in lunch and delivering it to workstations so that people stay out of the common areas and stay apart. And plus people appreciate, the free lunch, so to speak. So, different strategies to keep people separated.
It's good. It's good. All right, Andy's back, and we're gonna give him the floor. He was providing some really good oversight as to what the current state and potential future state is for the economy. As I mentioned, not total gloom and doom, but not the rapid response I think we're all hoping for. Andy, any final thoughts on that? And then I'd love for you to address the recent SGIA and NAPCO printing business indicator survey, and just what insights have you gleaned from that related specifically to the print community?
Yes, certainly, Pete. And I apologize. I don't know what happened. It finally let me back in. And as I mentioned in my previous response, the effects of this economic crisis are so unique and so profound that 2 weeks ago, SGIA and NAPCO launched a survey dedicated to measuring 2 things, really: the depth and scope of the crisis on our industry, and more importantly, what our peers are doing to create a path forward through the crisis and to the recovery ahead. And I'll just share with you some numbers, and then I'll talk briefly about what your peers are doing. We had about 500 participants, 74 of whom identified their primary business as apparel decoration. And the numbers are exactly what you'd expect, given that large swaths of the economy are shut down. And I'll just share some of them with you. On average, over the last 30 days, the apparel decorators who have participated in our survey report, on average, that their sales have declined by 68.3%. 92.6% report a decline in sales. 85.2% report that the decline was at least 40%. 46.3% report that the decline was at least 80%. And again, that's not to be negative. It's exactly what we'd expect given what's happened. Basically, for a whole lot of people, it's illegal to do business. It's illegal to even go into. That's exactly the kinds of numbers we would expect. Now, the bright spot, what was very, very encouraging is late in the survey, we asked folks, listen, what are we going to do to this recession? And the bright spot was the number of your peers who are taking very, very aggressive actions. Certainly the essentials, conserving cash, controlling costs, all the things I know my fellow panelists talked about in terms of ensuring the health and safety of their employees. But what I found very interesting is a number of them, as you were suggesting, Pete, are playing offense. They're identifying growth opportunities in pharmaceuticals, in healthcare, in food preparation and packaging, and they're positioning themselves to participate in industries that in fact have been growing through the recession. They are also doing a lot in terms of using social media to stay in touch with their clients. Now, here's the key. They aren't really trying to market or sell. What they're doing is joining their clients' LinkedIn networks, their Facebook pages, the forums their clients participate in. Not to market or sell, but to listen, observe, and learn. And they are identifying opportunities in how their clients' behavior is changing and is likely to change after the recession and the pandemic and all the disruptions it caused are behind us. They are beefing up, your colleagues are beefing up their web capabilities, their e-commerce capabilities, both to accommodate the current preference for purchasing digitally online and to prepare for the likelihood that that preference will grow, that folks will want to do more and more business digitally online, even when this is all behind us. And the other thing I thought was very interesting, and by the way, you'll read about all this in the report. We'll have the report to the SGIA membership, not next week, but the week after. Another thing I found very interesting, very encouraging, was something I just summarize as prevent a temporary separation from becoming permanent. And what your peers were talking about here is, listen, it may come down to having to lay off some of our most valuable employees. And the last thing we want is for that separation to become permanent, because participating in the recovery is going to be a lot harder without them. So they have a number of ideas about keeping in touch, supporting folks that have been laid off, that they want back, that they need to have, if in fact they're going to participate in the recovery. I just found it very, very interesting and very, very forward-thinking, all kinds of things about discussing the kind of local and national aid that is available for personal support, even talking about in depth everything the company is doing to ensure that their job, first of all, the company's going to make it through, and ensure that their job will be waiting for them when the crisis is over. A whole bunch of things your peers are doing to stay in touch and continue to support their best employees, to make sure they're back. A number of just one of the examples that that I found very encouraging in terms of not only getting through this, but again, preparing to participate in the recovery on the other side. And I want to read just one quote from one of your peers, a graphic design, apparel designer, and he summarized his comments as follow: "This market requires us to be creative, resourceful, and to gain and grow accounts." And he summarized the consensus beautifully, I thought. What I took away from the survey, and I think you'll take the same thing away when you see the results in a couple of weeks, is the majority of apparel decorators we surveyed are not exactly taking this lying down. They're not waiting for the next round of government stimulus. They're not hoping that the hot, humid summer weather slows propagation enough to allow the economy to reopen. They're taking decisive actions, both defensive actions, but also offensive actions. And as I say, I think you're going to find that very encouraging. SGIA members, look for the reports the week of May 11th.
All right. It's awesome, and little healthy mixture of sobriety, but also optimism. And I think you're right. One thing I've been really impressed with is this industry's resilience, and also just vulnerability and transparency. I mean, there have just been some really good information sharing and best practices happening through social media where, I mean, people are being vulnerable and saying, hey, we're hurting, to your point, validating some of the statistics that you just shared with us, but not giving up and not folding in, but saying, how do we pivot? How do we leverage or capitalize on opportunity that's now there that wasn't there? Everything from, obviously face masks becoming more of a revenue stream and a revenue source for decoration. I love what Chris Burnett and the Vapor team's doing with reaching out and kind of creating a whole new accessory that is vertically integrated from fabric to sublimation to end user, and with the net gaiters and things that they're doing. So lots of good stuff going on. Question came in on the chat, and I think it's worth kind of getting everybody's opinions and thoughts on. I think there's been this natural apprehension because of what's happened to just kind of don't be too salesy, don't reach out to clients, don't rock the boat. And same thing, I think a lot of the vendors that serve us as business owners, the ink vendors, the paper vendors, the packaging vendors, the apparel vendors, at some point we got to come out of this, right? And we've got to start getting back to our business strategies. So just would love to hear around the horn quick thoughts on when is the appropriate time for vendors to start reaching out to businesses to start reaching out to clients, and how should that be sequenced appropriately?
I'm happy to jump in.
Great.
I think that's a great question. It's something you said every entity, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a company, is struggling with how do we maintain sensitivity during this time, and also provide value and get back to economic recovery and growth. The national guideline in terms of President Trump has this reopening of America 3-phase approach. Now, every governor, every state is implementing it differently. Localities are implementing it differently. But it does give kind of a national framework, I think, a jumping off point to see as things start to reopen and people start to become customers again, that it's fine to sell to those customers again. So it seems to me we're in that phase, we've gotten through the emergency phase. We're kind of coming out of the mitigation phase and going into the recovery phase. And so I think taking those cues, really wherever your markets are, if you have regional customers or if you have customer base within your state, see what's happening in their state and region. And I think kind of modeling the reopening and re-engaging of the sales business is probably one way to approach it. I'm sure there are a variety of ways that will come out, and people may have different opinions, but I think that's one way to approach it.
And I would echo Lisbeth, because I'm being contacted by printers asking, well, what can I do? Who can I sell to? And it really is looking at those businesses that are being reopened at a state level. I think once it's your restaurants that are needed to be reopened. It's some of the other traditional non-essential stores. You're starting to see more garden centers reopening. And I think once those companies do reopen, then it's appropriate for printers to approach them, because they are going to need social distancing stickers on the floor. They're going to need the signage. They're going to need all of these other areas, of print that we've been providing to the grocery stores, the hospitals, and the other essential businesses. So, as Lisbeth mentioned, when you start looking at how the states are implementing the administration's overarching recovery plan, you just need to structure your sales function based, I think, on that recovery plan.
So obviously we've been following this in the news, tons of resources available, tons of stimulus money, and recently another 2 to 3 trillion added to what's already out there. The questions coming in from a lot of people in the industry: what does this continued stimulus what's the impact of this continued stimulus on inflation for the future? Would just love to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, it's a great concern. And the thing with fiscal stimulus, for some reason, folks think fiscal stimulus is very simple. The more you spend, the more you stimulate, but it doesn't work that way. What matters is not how much, but how effective. And unfortunately, too often, stimulus ends up stimulating nothing more than the national debt, which is already at $23 trillion. And as the attendee indicated, that has serious consequences for not just inflation, but interest rates and productivity and the long-term growth of the American economy. And the answer is that, again, as with everything else, this is uncharted. We've never had to deal with something like this, and the Federal Reserve is going to have to find a way to absorb all the liquidity that both they and Washington have created to get us through the recession. And I just don't know how well they're going to be able to do that. They're also playing it by ear. They've never ever dealt with a situation like this. So I would not be concerned about inflation for the next year or so. But if the Federal Reserve does not aggressively mop up all this liquidity, I think by 2022 or late 2021, we could be seeing significant effects on inflation and subsequently interest rates. We're going to have to watch that very, very carefully. But this type of stuff is certainly not a free lunch. There are significant economic consequences. And if we get it wrong, one of those consequences is sharp increases in inflation, interest rates, and unfortunately, it pushes us right back onto the verge of a recession if interest rates rise too sharply. So, I mean, the Fed has its job cut out for it, and we'll just again have to watch very carefully how well they're able to do it and execute on it.
Good. Lisbeth.
Yeah, I think it's a timely question, very timely, because those questions are starting to get more attention on Capitol Hill even this week.
Yeah.
We've seen the response from the federal government. We've now had 3.5 stimulus bills related to COVID. The first 2 were pumped out within 2 weeks, which is like lightning speed in terms of the way Congress works. They were also fairly, bipartisan, non-controversial. As we got into the third stimulus, you started to see a little more of the horse trading that is typical in negotiating big policy. But these were massive $1 trillion bills of over 800 pages in legislation and trillions of dollars out the door. The 3.5 stimulus, that was the recapitalization of the PPP. So that was almost just kind of a housekeeping. We need to add more to the fund. The next really big piece of legislation is going to be what's considered the fourth stimulus legislation. And you're already seeing now this bipartisan and this urgency and this rush to just shovel dollars out the door starting to come to a halt. And, there will be at least a month probably before we see the next stimulus out. And that's because there are going to be some ideological questions that are going to be asked about looking at the spending. The senators that I've talked to this week, at least 2 of them that I talked to this week, both said, we want to take a breath. And we've shoveled all these dollars out the door. We want to see how effective it's being, whether it's the dollars that have gone to hospitals or small business or state and local governments, before opening the spigot again. And so I think you're going to see a slowing down in the pace of the stimulus. And, that's all related to these overall financial concerns.
Why don't we go around the horn, just kind of final thoughts from everybody, just minute or so, kind of final charge for those on the webinar, but those will also be tuning in afterwards, just to kind of leave them with a final thought. Adriane, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I would say that, wait, yeah, I'm unmuted. Yay. I would suggest that being really straightforward with your employees. I know that it's a minefield right now. Some people make more money being unemployed than being called back to work under the PPP program, stuff like that. I think it's really important to, as you go forward, be transparent, let them understand, these are the challenges of running the business right now. But if we don't stay open and running, our customers will go somewhere else and we won't have a business to run. So, all for one for all, and help them feel safe and valued with small gestures and good processes.
That's great. Marci?
I think everyone needs to understand that business, as Andy has indicated, business will start to come back. I think that the screen industry and the digital industry are probably some of the more enthusiastic and also imaginative business people. I think that we've seen that already with companies that have reopened and have invigorated their manufacturing chains, where they've started to produce, they were producing face shields and they were looking at antimicrobial signage, etc. So I think that the screen and digital industry needs to really understand that business will come back. It may not come back to the same levels as we're expecting right away, but they also need to be that entrepreneurial, innovative, and they need to look out and see what's out there that they can take advantage of.
Great. Lisbeth?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a point in the future, undoubtedly, where every business leader is going to be asked, how did your company respond during the great pandemic of 2020? I think that everyone should think about what do you want your answer to be? How did you help your company? How did you help your employees? How did you help your community? What new stakeholders did you realize you needed to be part of your business as part of this response? And how are you going to tell that story, and who is going to tell it? So it's something I think that everyone should keep in mind, because this will be an inflection point we all look back on. And I would echo Marci and say also, along with that, what business opportunities and innovations, the necessity is the mother of invention, did your company come up with during this emergency and mitigation phase? And how can you leverage that as a business opportunity going forward when we are back to whatever our semblance of new normal might be?
It's really good. Andy?
Yeah, no, I would just echo what my colleague said. Entrepreneurial spirit. There is more opportunity than we think now, not in the traditional places, not by doing traditional things, not through traditional methods, but opportunities with our employees, with our community, and with our clients. And I'm just going to recommend two articles. I summarized them in a piece I wrote on the COVID-19 resource channel, but I found them not only inspiring, but they also address this whole issue of opportunity and what I can be doing now. One is titled "A Way Forward for Small Businesses," and the other is titled "How Retailers Can Reach Consumers Who Aren't Spending." It's not about our industry, but every word in it is relevant to our industry. You will find them both at this address, hbr.org. No charge to download them. Spend half an hour with them, and you'll come out seeing that, boy, there's more opportunity here if we're creative about it than we may realize.
Love it. I'll close with this. Here is a list of businesses, and you've probably heard of all these, that started in the midst of the 08-09 financial crisis. Airbnb, Uber, WhatsApp, Slack, Square, and Groupon. all businesses that shaped the last 10 years of e-commerce and of just consumer behavior in general. So you all made this point, and I'm just going to kind of punctuate it, that this is a time for innovation. This is a time for creativity. And we've heard this said many times by many industry experts, but we will emerge stronger as a result of this. And I think we're seeing big and small examples of that. And I've become a bigger reader in this season than ever before, reading both kind of industry specific stuff, but also just general leadership. Pat Lencioni is one of my favorite authors, and he writes about vulnerability-based trust. And I think you all mentioned this, but really, it really starts with how we're making the customer feel. And so we've got to use a little bit of awareness and a kind of emotional intelligence here with how we're making our customers feel. But we need to take the time to do this well. Value effectiveness over efficiency. I think you all made that point of just what's effective now is what we need to be focusing on, and embrace personalization over professionalism. And I think we've seen a lot of really good examples of that on social media, just reaching out, meeting people where they're at. I think this for us is new. I mean, we've got, dogs barking in the background, we've got Zoom settings, but that's it. It's personal, and it's a little raw, and it's a little unfiltered, but this is what we need right now. We don't need to be buttoned up and perfectly presented. We just need to be vulnerable and honest and get through this together. Well, I'm going to just kind of close this out. I want to thank all the panelists and thank those who tuned in live and will be watching this recording later. And hopefully this will be one of maybe some future SGIA Apparel Decorators Town Hall meetings. The SGIA, as a reminder, is an association built by and for the printing industry, and really dedicated to serving industry, and hopefully the industry feels as though we've served them in a meaningful way today. To learn more about the benefits of becoming a member and how SGIA can help you grow your business, visit sgia.org. We also talked a number of times about the COVID-19 resource page, which is on sgia.org, and encourage everybody to check that out. There's constantly adding new information on that page, which is really helpful to everyone trying to navigate these unprecedented times. So panelists, thank you all very much, and stay safe and stay healthy.